In this lecture, we're going to be talking about attitudes. We're now officially moving from the section of the course where we're talking about how people form opinions and judgments and perceive other people, to now talking about attitudes and sort of how people come to believe the things about the world in general that they do. Okay, so let me start off. I want to read something to you, just a little scenario. All right. One pleasant summer evening in 1930, a car pulled into a parking lot of a moderately expensive restaurant on the Pacific Coast. The driver was a middle-aged Caucasian man. He was on vacation with a younger Chinese couple who were his good friends. The three friends had been traveling all day, so they did not have reservations at the restaurant. Because the lot was almost full, the driver asked his friends to go in and get a table, and his wife to get a table while he looked for a parking spot. As the car drove away, the Chinese man and his wife hesitated at the front door and glanced at each other fearfully. The young couple had good reason to be afraid. Although they were suitably dressed for the restaurant, they were also Chinese. In the early 1930s, according to the newspaper and radio reports, Californians intensely disliked anyone of Asian origin. Odd as it may seem to us today, Californians at the time had very negative attitudes about the recent Asian immigrants, some legal and some illegal. Anti-Chinese sentiments were so strong that the Chinese couple suspected they would not only be unable to get a table, but they would be told to leave. Putting aside their fear, however, the couple dutifully entered the restaurant and requested a table for three. To the Chinese couple's astonishment, they were shown to an excellent table by the window overlooking the ocean. The waiter was extremely courteous, both before and after they were joined by their friend. If anything, the Caucasian friend thought that they received more attentive service than he would have expected had he been alone or with other Caucasians. The scene was repeated after dinner when the three friends drove to a well-known area hotel. Again, the Caucasian driver pulled and parked, while his Chinese friends, went to reserve two rooms. Not only did they receive excellent rooms, but the receptionist, the bell captain, and all the hotel staff were extremely polite and welcoming. The three friends continued to take extensive motoring vacations together for the next 2 years. During that time, they visited 184 restaurants or cafes, 66 hotels, and they were refused service only one time. Some of the places that the friends visited were large and some were small. Some were expensive, some were inexpensive. Sometimes the Caucasian driver accompanied the Chinese couple when they first asked for the service, and sometimes he didn't. The Caucasian driver started keeping records of how many times they received a reception that he regarded as normal, better than normal, or hesitant. Okay? All right. And so, after the long story, I'm going to stop reading now and just tell you the rest of the story. So the Caucasian driver was actually a professor at a university, and he kept track of how often he and his Chinese friends received normal service, better than normal service, or whether or not people were pretty hesitant to accommodate him and his Chinese friends during the 1930s. And what he noticed was that most people gave them either normal service or better than normal service. So despite the fact that, if you polls or surveys were saying that Californians during this time had a negative attitude towards Chinese people, the Caucasian professor was really interested to find out that despite these attitudes people were reporting, their behavior was just the opposite of that. They were being really nice to the Chinese couple. So the reason I start off with that story is because it leads really great into our lecture about attitudes and what exactly is an attitude and how do attitudes relate to our behaviors. So an attitude is a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating a particular entity with either some degree of favor or some degree of disfavor, okay? And the reason I say that it's psychological is because it's something that happens on the inside. It's internal. So, for example, a psychological attitude would be something like believing that people who use drugs are bad, okay? So that's my belief, okay? Now, if we see drug posters, those aren't really attitudes. Those are external. Those are, things that we can see. Attitudes are behavioral. They're psychological. I say tendency, psychological tendency, because it's not necessarily something that somebody has forever. The attitudes that you have right now may change tomorrow. They may change in 10 years. They may change in 20 years, just depending on your life experiences, things that you hear, information that you learn. So it's a tendency. It doesn't mean it isn't always true in every situation. And then I say evaluating, because remember, attitudes are kind of like our beliefs and our judgments, and they're either positive or they're negative. So you evaluate if you believe something is positive or negative. So an attitude is a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating a particular entity with some degree of favor or disfavor. There are 3 components to attitudes that you should know. They're thoughts, feelings, and actions. Okay? So all 3 of these things, thoughts, feelings, and actions, make up an attitude. We, as people, if I say something, you probably have a thought about it, you probably have a feeling about it, and you probably maybe even have some kind of behavior that demonstrates whether you think or feel positively or negatively about it. So let me give you an example, okay? So it was interesting because remember in the scenario I read to you, Californians were reporting that they had negative attitudes about people, about Chinese people, okay? So an example of the thought component of an attitude would be someone saying, I think Chinese people are stealing American jobs, or I don't think Chinese people are stealing American jobs. Thoughts are cold, they're calculated, they're emotionless, they're beliefs, okay? They're just what I think. They're just facts that I believe to be true, or you believe to be true, or someone believes to be true, okay? So there can be negative thoughts, and there can be positive thoughts. Feelings, on the other side of that, feelings are more emotional. They're kind of what we feel in our gut. So for example, one example of a feeling someone could have is they could say, I feel angry that Chinese people snuck into my country. Or they could say, I don't really care. I don't really feel anything when I think about about Chinese people sneaking into our country. Okay, so those are feelings. Feelings are more, I talk about feeling words like angry, happy, mad, sad, joyful, excited. Those are feelings. Okay, so that's the second component of attitudes. The third component of attitudes are actions. Actions are behaviors that we actually do. So a type of action that kind of is a component of an attitude is maybe I go to the polls and I vote to make it illegal for immigrants to come to America. Okay, so the action I did was I went out and voted. Okay, so that was an action. So 3 components to attitudes: thoughts, feelings, and actions. Okay, and the thing about these 3 components is they don't always match up. That's the complex thing about attitudes. All 3 components of an attitude don't necessarily always match together. If you think about the people in California in that scenario I read, they were reporting, if somebody asked, what do you think about Chinese people? They might say, oh, I think they're coming in and stealing our jobs. I feel angry that they're coming in and stealing our jobs. I think that if one came into my restaurant, I wouldn't even serve them, okay? But then what did we find out? We found out that they actually were. Their actions were different from what they were saying their thoughts and feelings were. So the Caucasian professor that was in that scenario, he actually went back and sent out surveys to all of the 168 or whatever restaurants that he and his Chinese friends visited, and he asked them, what do you think about Chinese people? How do you feel about Chinese people? What do you think you would do if a Chinese person tried to come to your restaurant? Most of the restaurants that he sent the surveys to said, I think negatively about Chinese people, I feel negatively about Chinese people, and I would not serve a Chinese person if they came in my restaurant. But guess what? All the restaurants he sent those surveys to, all the restaurants that told him they had negative feelings and thoughts about Chinese people, were the same restaurants that when it actually came down to their actions, did the opposite. Their actions were the opposite of their thoughts and feelings. They did serve the Chinese people. So in this case, in a lot of these cases, it was interesting because the thoughts and feelings these people were reporting were very different from their actions. We'll talk more about that later. But what I want to kind of move to now is how exactly do researchers assess attitudes? How do researchers find out about people's attitudes? And the reason I want to talk about this is because you guys might actually be doing a little bit of this for your papers. So there are 2 ways that researchers find out about people's attitudes. There are direct ways and indirect ways.